I never thought installing a simple black metal gate would spark an all-out war with the homeowners association. But then again, I had underestimated Mrs. Peterson. It started as a matter of practicality. People kept using my driveway to turn around, leaving tire marks and scuffing my pavement. I saved up for months, checked all the HOA regulations, and got the proper permits before installing the gate. It matched the style of the neighborhood, operated smoothly with a remote, and gave me peace of mind. But Mrs. Peterson, our self-appointed HOA enforcer, had other plans. I first noticed her taking pictures of my driveway while I was watering my plants. She wasn't even trying to hide it, just standing there in her perfectly pressed tennis outfit, documenting my so-called crime. When I waved and asked if everything was okay, she huffed and stormed back to her house, her designer sneakers clicking on the sidewalk. The next day, I found a bright yellow violation notice taped to my mailbox. Urgent, unauthorized modification, HOA violation. I couldn't believe my eyes. The gate had been up for less than 48 hours, and already, Mrs. Peterson was on the attack. I decided to handle it the right way. I walked over to her house that evening with my HOA approval papers and some homemade cookies from my mom's recipe. I figured a friendly approach might smooth things over. But before I could even ring the doorbell, her security camera cracked to life. "I'm documenting everything," Mrs. Peterson's voice announced through the speaker. "That gate is reducing our property values. The HOA board will hear about this at tomorrow's emergency meeting." Emergency meeting? Over a gate? I called my dad for advice, but he was away at a police conference in Denver. "Just keep your cool," he said. "Document everything. Mrs. Peterson's been pulling stunts like this since before you were born." What I didn't know then was that Mrs. Peterson had already been rallying the neighbors against me, spreading rumors, and plotting her next move. This wasn't just about my gate. It was about control. That night, my security camera pinged. Mrs. Peterson was back, this time with two other HOA board members, measuring my driveway in the dark with flashlights. They whispered and pointed, no doubt strategizing their next attack. I recorded everything, trying not to laugh at how ridiculous they looked skulking around my property. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In Mrs. Peterson's hand was a business card for Elite HOA Enforcement Solutions. I zoomed in on the security footage and Googled the company. What I found sent chills down my spine. They were a private security firm known for aggressive tactics. They had their own K-9 unit. My phone buzzed with a text. "Mrs. Peterson, meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Attendance is mandatory. Bring your checkbook. Fines start at $500 per day." I looked out my window at the gate I'd worked so hard to install. It stood there gleaming under the streetlights, perfectly aligned with all the HOA guidelines. What I didn't know then was that this gate would become the center of a neighborhood war. And Mrs. Peterson had no idea who she was messing with. The next morning, I walked into the HOA's community hall to find every seat filled. Residents whispered as I entered, their eyes darting between me and Mrs. Peterson, who stood at the front with a self-satisfied smirk. She cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. "We are here today to discuss the blatant disregard for community aesthetics and safety policies regarding an unauthorized gate installation." I raised my hand. I followed every regulation. I have the permits to prove it. Mrs. Peterson scoffed. "That may be so, but the board has decided that your gate is disruptive. The fines will stand. Unless, of course, you remove it immediately." I took a deep breath. I won't be removing anything. I have legal rights. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some of the neighbors nodded, while others looked nervous. One man, Mr. Lawson, stood up. "Mrs. Peterson, isn't it true that any modification that meets city code and HOA guidelines should be allowed? Why is this different?" Mrs. Peterson's eye twitched. "This is about preserving the integrity of our neighborhood." Another neighbor, Mrs. Chun, crossed her arms. "Or is this about control?" That's when I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. After the meeting, neighbors approached me, whispering their own stories. Mr. Lawson had been fined for a flower bed that wasn't HOA approved. Mrs. Chin's daughter had been reprimanded for riding her bike too fast in the cul-de-sac. "She's been abusing her power for years," Mrs. Chin said, "but no one's ever pushed back." "Then let's change that." I replied. We started organizing. I collected testimonies, printed out copies of past HOA rulings, and even contacted a local lawyer specializing in property disputes. The more I dug, the more I realized that Mrs. Peterson had a history of selectively enforcing rules to target homeowners she didn't like. Then, an anonymous email arrived in my inbox. Subject: HOA funds. Look closer. Attached were scanned documents, financial records showing thousands of dollars in mismanaged HOA funds. This was bigger than a gate. This was corruption. And now, I had the proof. I spent the next day analyzing the financial records from the anonymous email. The numbers didn't add up. HOA fees had nearly doubled over the past 5 years, yet community improvements were minimal. Where was all the money going? I forwarded the documents to Tom, a lawyer, and an old family friend. Within an hour, he called back. This is embezzlement, plain and simple. The HOA is supposed to report financials to homeowners annually. Have you ever seen a full report? I thought back. Not once. They always claim confidentiality or say it's available upon request, but no one ever gets it. Tom exhaled. They've been hiding something. We need to get these records in front of the homeowners. I called an emergency neighborhood meeting at my house. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, my living room was packed. People were sitting on the floor, standing against walls, and spilling into the kitchen. Even some of the more hesitant neighbors showed up, curiosity getting the better of them. I stood at the front. I know Mrs. Peterson has been ruling this HOA like a dictator, but this isn't just about my gate anymore. We have proof that she's been mismanaging HOA funds. Murmurs spread through the room. I held up a stack of printed reports. HOA fees have increased 40% in the past 5 years, yet there are no major community improvements. Meanwhile, Peterson's home value has skyrocketed, and there are mysterious payments to a private security firm. Mr. Lawson stood up. You're telling me we've been paying extra fees just to fund her power trip? That's exactly what I'm saying. Mrs. Chin shook her head. She's been bullying this neighborhood for years. It's time we take action. Then let's push for a recall vote, I said. We get enough signatures, we can remove her from power. Everyone nodded in agreement. The battle had officially begun. The next morning, I woke to find my driveway vandalized with spray-painted words, "Traitor to the community." I wasn't surprised. Within hours, Mrs. Peterson launched a counterattack. Flyers appeared in mailboxes calling me a disruptive troublemaker who wanted to dismantle the HOA. Social media posts accused me of turning the neighborhood into chaos. Raymond texted me. She's scared. Keep going. I smiled. If this was her best attempt to stop me, she was already losing. We gathered 60% of the required signatures within 3 days. But Mrs. Peterson wasn't done fighting. The HOA announced an emergency security measure, a new policy allowing immediate fines for anti-HOA behavior. My mailbox was suddenly flooded with notices. $500 for unauthorized gatherings. $200 for excessive lawn signs, aka our recall vote posters. I took the fine straight to Tom. This is harassment. Tom grinned. And it's illegal. Time to take this to court. We filed an injunction, stopping all fines and freezing HOA spending until the financials were audited. The neighborhood erupted in support. The final battle was coming. And I was ready. The recall vote was scheduled for the following Saturday. The HOA board had no choice but to allow it. Our petition had well over the required number of signatures, and legal pressure was mounting. Mrs. Peterson didn't go down quietly. She held a last-minute community emergency meeting, claiming that my actions were tearing the neighborhood apart. But this time, the crowd wasn't on her side. When the ballots were counted, the result was overwhelming. 83% voted in favor of her removal. Mrs. Peterson sat in stunned silence as the new HOA president, Mr. Lawson, took the podium. Effective immediately, all unlawful fines will be revoked, an independent financial audit will begin, and transparency will be restored. The room erupted in applause. Mrs. Peterson stormed out, refusing to acknowledge the outcome. But it was over. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent a massive overhaul. The financial audit uncovered years of mismanagement, and legal action was taken against Mrs. Peterson for misappropriation of funds. The neighborhood began to heal. Homeowners, once afraid of stepping out of line, now had a voice. The new board focused on real community improvement, without fear-mongering or corruption. As for my gate, it remained exactly where I had built it. No fines, no threats, just peace. One evening, I stood in my driveway as the sun set, watching kids ride their bikes down the street, no longer afraid of HOA retaliation. Raymond walked up and patted me on the back. "You did it. We did it." I nodded. "We made sure they never pull this stunt again." And just like that, life in the neighborhood was finally ours again.